Makes me very happy to introduce Jules Feiffer. A happy task, introduce a good friend, great writer. Writing life, as a lot of us know in this room, is not often happy, sometimes quite unhappy. I tell my students, I will tell them again, of the woman who wrote to an author a letter saying, "I have prayed for the death of 2 other writers and have been successful twice." But it's a happy, happy task to introduce Jules. The pleasure derives from 2 sources. One is the sheer admiration of a first-class writer who has written beautifully in all forms, movie scripts and plays, and of course the drawn figures all these years, these wonderful figures in the cartoon that taught us what it meant to be seriously hilarious. And the other is the joy of knowing him and the joy of being around him, a joy spread among students in this college when he came to teach at Southampton, the writing program a few years ago, and immediately established a wholehearted devotion to the students which was matched by theirs to him. The college gave Jules an honorary degree a few years ago, and part of the citation thanked him for teaching us to face the music and dance. You know the Fred Astaire line, "Let's face the music and dance." It was appropriate several ways, not the least of which was that Jules' totemic figure, his symbolic god, is Fred Astaire. And why not? They both greet the world with this thoughtful grace. In recent years, Jules has turned his hand to children's books. Fitting too, he's very childlike himself. We all are. All writers are basically childlike. We use childlike, others say infantile. We are what we are. But there's something to it in writing because no matter how miserable the world or how hard it is the life we try to transcribe or transform, the very act of writing is some sort of statement of hope, childlike hope. And we're out of it generally. All writers are out of things. You will remember that moment, you writers. You will remember the moment in class when you were staring out the window as you've been staring out the window through the entire class. And the teacher said, as she said to me, "Roger, would you care to rejoin the group?" And I think, not really. But once in a while we do. We rejoin the group, we come out to play. And when we come out to play, we choose our playmates very carefully, very carefully. And our favorite playmate, our very favorite playmate, is the man who teaches us to weep and to laugh in the same breath, and who teaches us to watch life with a severe yet generous love. Jules Feiffer.
I assure you I'm not going to stand behind this much tonight just for this moment or two. But thank you, Roger. If that is your name. The key word in that appreciative but not nearly appreciative enough introduction was play. You know, one of the things in teaching here at Southampton I've talked about very often in terms of writing. It was a sense of play. 2 things most often, play and failure. This is what, if you play as hard as I do, you fail a lot, and that's part of the play. And the sooner one gets to know that and deal with it, you never really deal with it happily, but you learn to deal with it, you just get on with what your job is. And my job this evening, I'm amused to think, is to deliver a keynote speech at a writers' conference when I am best known as a cartoonist. And therefore, I'm going to begin the evening with a quote from What Else? Old Time Radio, which doesn't involve anything I've ever done before, but does involve one of the great, if not writers of humor, one of the inspirers of humor that we've ever had, a man named Jack Benny. Have you ever heard of him? Because I think in terms of what I want to talk about tonight, which are words and pictures, which is what I've been doing all my professional life and long before I had a professional life. Why is my daughter making a funny face at me? I learned more than I can say from listening to old-time radio, comedy and drama, shows like Suspense, comedians like Fred Allen, but particularly Jack Benny, and the most, what brought this to mind tonight, because I'm talking about words and pictures, is the most famous, I suppose, of the Jack Benny gags when he's walking down the street, quiet street at night, and you hear the click, 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 the sound effects, because radio was full of sound effects that created these incredible pictures in your head. I mean, it told you everything you needed to know. And he's walking down the street, click, 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 and he's suddenly stopped by a gruff voice who says, "Your money or your life?" And then there's no response at all. And for a long time, there's no response at all. And I think the robber, the mugger, must say it again, and it goes on, complete silence for what seemed like nearly a minute. And the noise you hear is from the studio audience just building up into this hysterical outburst because they know and have known all their lives the character and reputation of Jack Benny as being this cheap guy. And finally the mugger says, "Well?" And Jack Benny says, "I'm thinking." Now that's funny, not because of the line, but because of what's left out. It's funny because of the silence. The silence made that work. And it's the use of silence and the use of nonverbal symbols and metaphors in one's work that's as important as what you put down. And from the time I was a boy cartoonist, one of the things I started studying and learning about in the combination of words and pictures was how you combine the two. Recently, it just closed on June 30th, a group of young actors, all Wesleyan graduates, did a production of my cartoons on stage called Feiffer's People. And all it is a smorgasbord of cartoons, all of which were written before they were born, these kids. And in one of them, the one I thought in some ways was the most effective, and I'm talking about it because I had the least to do with the reason it was effective. It's a young man and woman necking on stage, and he is in profile, petting and feeling her up and just doing all sorts of things, and you see her expression is increasing discomfort and disdain, and it builds and builds and builds, and the more he paws her, the more unhappy and disgusted she looks. And finally, he says, "Do you think there's life after death?" And then he goes on nuzzling her some more, and you see her just look almost turning violent in her sense of reproach. But not a word is spoken until she finally says, maybe close to a minute later, "What do you call this?" And now, the reason I mentioned that is when I actually did it as a cartoon, I just had two talking heads facing forward, with none of the subtext that this piece of small drama contained, and I thought it was a wonderful description and wonderful example of what you do in the combination of words and pictures, of images playing against text, and it also completely and tightly wound together that when it works, as it should work, you're not even aware when one starts and the other falls off. It's all just one thing. So what I want to do tonight, if I can find the remote, see, we are, God, I'm never speaking here again. Oh, it's on the floor. One drink and that's what, I'm going to show you, if I may, as we say in show business. Can we get the lights up, please? This is all words and pictures. Many of you who know my work will know of my dancer. I've been doing her since, 1957, the first dance to spring. And here she is. She says, "A dance to autumn. In this dance, I celebrate corporate mergers." And she moves. Disney buys Cap Cities, buys Westinghouse, buys CBS, buys Time Warner, buys Turner Broadcasting, buys Chase Bank, buys Chem Bank, buys the president, buys the Congress, buys you, buys me, buy. So, I mean, it says as much as I want to say about this sort of thing, and it says it all through the combination of dance and language, and neither would have any meaning at all except together. And that's what I always loved about the comic strip. from the time I was a kid and started reading comic strips in these Sunday supplements in beautiful color and beautiful art, unlike anything one sees today, where seamlessly words and pictures and comic strips like Popeye and Polly and the Pals and Lil Abner and Terry and the Pirates would go forth and create these universes which, because of the reduced size of comic strips, really can't exist anymore in the way they did in those years. But what they taught me is the use of words combined with body language. I can't go to Jimmy's house because it's Jimmy's turn to come to my house. Because I went to Jimmy's house last time. But I like to go to Jimmy's house. And Jimmy doesn't like to come to my house. But if he won't come to my house, I can't go to his house. Because fair's fair. So I won't ever see Jimmy again. Boy, is 7 hard. Now, this is, this is cartoonist heaven, because nothing tells you about the inside workings of a mind more than a young boy or young girl's body language. They haven't learned, as we all have as adults, to repress everything, to hold it in tight, and so you can see the most awful things gripping yourself. But kids haven't learned to grip themselves yet, so it all shows out, and that's the fun I have in doing these kids' books that I've been doing over the last 10 years. But I also did politics, as some of you remember. This was one on Nixon, and again, it's all tried to keep it very, very simple. This is right after Nixon's death. I'm trying to read this so I don't get in people's way. Watergate will fade in time, and Nixon will be seen as a great president, the first person says. Why, asked the second one. Because of his foreign policy achievements, such as the opening of China. What was great about that? No Democratic president would have had Nixon's courage to go to China. Why not? He would have been brutally attacked for being soft on communism. By who, asked the second person? Nixon, says the first person. Now, if that had been drawn by two guys sitting at a desk or at a bar or something, I don't think it could have been nearly as effective. It's just the simplicity of it. Again, it's words and pictures. Or this is Jimmy Carter, who, before he became a great ex-president, was a terribly pious, self-righteous, smug little president. But he learned on the job how to become an ex-president, and I admire him now, but not at the time of this cartoon, where he's little Jimmy, sitting in Plains, Georgia, by the seashore. He says, "Fish, I am hungry. My family is hungry. There are few of us and many of you. I call upon you to do the adequate, competent, and decent thing for the common good." This farmer comes along, "What are you doing, little Jimmy?" And Jimmy says, "Fishing." "But you didn't bring a pole." And Jimmy says, "But I have faith. The fish will do what is right." And then there's the first Bush. Do you all remember the first Bush? And what he's saying is the time of the Gulf War. Okay, what I first had in mind was a little war of little duration, little casualties, possibly a little terrorism, a little dissent, but with little disruption of our lives, proving once and for all I'm not a little man. And by the last panel, he's the size of a midget. So again, this would mean nothing if you just read the text of it. But with the drawing, it suddenly becomes an entirely different thing. This was possibly the first political cartoon ever run in New Yorker. It was on Bill Clinton. Some of you may remember him. And this is June of his first year in office. And she's saying, it's called The Boyfriend. And this woman is saying, "Bill Clinton reminds me of the kind of man I fell for in my 20s. He'd show up late, but with a perfect excuse. He'd stand me up and look so pained when he explained that I'd forgive him. I'd catch him in a lie. He'd deny it with such eloquence I'd doubt my own senses. I'd confront him with his deceptions. He'd look at me as if I were crazy and needed help. I wish I'd known when I voted for Bill Clinton that I wasn't getting a president, but another sick relationship." And I love doing old people because they spoke for me when I was young, just as children have spoken for me when I'm old. I'm a perverse creature, and this is an old man saying, "I used to think I was poor," and then they told me I wasn't poor, I was needy. Then they told me it was self-defeating to think of myself as needy, I was deprived. Then they told me deprived was a bad image, I was underprivileged. Then they told me underprivileged was overused, I was disadvantaged. I still don't have a dime, but I have a great vocabulary. And then, moving away from politics, which these days I'm particularly happy to do, that much of my work always was about the world or non-world or surreal world of relationships. And the monologue form was always one that I adored. People who were trying to figure out what wasn't clear to them when it becomes increasingly clear to the reader. She gave a look as we came out of the movies. By this time I thought I knew all her looks, but this one was new to me. Then she said something I couldn't quite make out. I should have said what, but that look of hers, plus the softened tone of her voice, convinced me it would be a mistake. What if it was one of those intimate shared moments and she found out I hadn't shared it? It would be mortifying to both of us. I was afraid of making a fool of myself, so I pretended I had heard. I nodded and said, I think you're probably right. She never spoke to me again. This I use an example of having no subtext at all. It's Freud's answering machine. This is Dr. Freud. I am in consultation. After the tone, please leave your name and a brief message. Thank you. Beep. Freud, this is Tolstoy. I can't make today's session. My life is out of control. My wife is out of control. Beep. This is Lenin. Your bill has arrived. I think you're a capitalist stooge and lackey. And I really hate your machine. Or is this more resistance on my part? Beep. Dr. Freud, this is Margaret Sanger. I dreamed I had your baby. I'm worried. Please call. Beep. This is Franklin Roosevelt. In our last session, you said I had nothing to fear but fear itself. What did you mean exactly? I am terribly confused. Beep. This is Gandhi. I know you're listening. It troubles me that I manipulate others in order to have my own way. I won't eat again until I hear from you. The form that first started me in this business, and that I abandoned after a few years, and now I'm back to, is the form of the narrative cartoon, which uses words and pictures in a different way because it uses less dialogue and more overall narration. This is what got me into the business of political and social satire was getting drafted into the Army during the waning days of the Korean War in 1951. And I thought this was a great injustice, not necessarily the war itself, but that they would take me into the Army. When I had a career in mind. Now, this is all about Munro, who it's for. This is not straight through, but Munro plays all the games that the kids play, has a great time with his friends until one day a letter arrives. It's from his draft board. He had one of his big friends read it to him. It's from local draft board 92, and it says, your friends and neighbors send you greetings. So while other children jumped rope and hula hooped and chased each other around the block and did exactly what it was normal for them to do, Munro came to the shocking realization at the age of 4, he had been drafted. So Munro goes into the Army. He's a full-fledged soldier, knowing the injustice of all of this, knowing that some awful mistake has been made. He goes to his sergeant. Now, those of you who've had any service in the Army or any service in the military know that when you walk into a superior's office, and they're all superiors, the first thing they do to you is never respond. So Munro stands around for a long, long time, and he finally says, I'm only 4. And he gets no answer, and he says it again, and he says it again, and he says it again. And finally the sergeant says, it is the official policy of the Army not to draft men of 4, ergo you cannot be 4, ergo you only think you are 4, go on sick call. And it's this story of Munro, as it turns out, that he's convinced that if all of these smart people, because he goes to the psychiatrist and he goes to the chaplain and he goes to the doctor, and they all tell him one way or another, through one lie after another, to straighten out, to shape up, to stop making these excuses, stop malingering. So he realizes that if all of these incredible people, these smart people, these superior people, could say he's not for, he can't be for, and he's convinced that he's not, and he's going to be the best soldier he can, and then the rest of the story unwinds. But this is my first attempt to get across, in some degree, my politics, and a greater degree, my rage at mindless authority, which has been the subject matter for my work all of these years. But it's also the point of trying to, through a kind of innocence or corrupted or thwarted innocence, show a view of society that I saw at that time, and I still very much see at this time. Let's see. At this point, showing you what I'm doing at this time, I want to read to you and show you the drawings that go with it, or some of the drawings that go with it. A fairly long narrative piece I did, which is going to be, when I get around to it, a book of text and drawings like Munro. It's called Little Fox Blues, and this is it. Or as we say, it goes something like this. Nick and Nell were ballroom dancers. They won prizes in contests. Nick taught Nell everything she knew. He taught her the waltz, the tango, and best of all, he taught her the foxtrot. The advance, the glide, the advance, the glide, the break and the dip. Nell looked drop-dead gorgeous on the dance floor. Nick was in love with her, but he was scared of saying so. He tried to show it in the way he danced. Nell must not have been paying attention. She respected Nick as a teacher and a dancing partner, but it was another dancer she gave her heart to. Electric, flamboyant, Enrique Vega, the Spanish dancer. Nell used all the steps Nick taught her to dance with Enrique Vega. Nick hated the sight of him. He was the only one. The dance crowd drew a circle around them and applauded wildly. Nick couldn't help but notice that it was a bigger circle than the crowd that formed for him and Nell. Nell was slipping away. What would he do without her? He couldn't imagine dancing with another partner. He couldn't imagine dancing alone. Nick knew people who danced alone. He thought they were stuck up, or poor lost souls looking for a partner. Nick wasn't stuck up. He was more the poor lost soul type, but not so long as he had Nell. One day, Mac Black, the billionaire software, hardware, menswear store owner, offered Nell and Enrique Vega a job. I want you two to dance at my new gaming casino that I have opened in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Nell left Nick the next day. She tried to be kind, but there's no way to be kind when you're leaving someone who's crazy about you. She told Nick, "This is my opportunity. If you're offered an opportunity, you have to take it. Someday you'll be offered an opportunity and you'll take it." Nick said, "Not if it hurts anyone's feelings." "Then I pity you," said Nell, and left for Harrisburg. Nick tried to be upbeat about it. "Nell's not the only fish in the sea. I will find me another, even better partner." Nick did go out and find other partners. He hated them. Some were good, some were very good, some were better dancers, better looking, and better friends to Nick than Nell. But they meant nothing to him. Nell, out of sight, had become, in Nick's mind, a goddess. Nick stopped making his regular rounds of dance halls. What was the point? He stopped rehearsing in front of a mirror. The reflection of him dancing alone was more than he could bear. He took off looking for a place where no one knew him or Nell. That would have been most places. But the only place that seemed right was the deep, dark woods. Nick went for long walks in the deep, dark woods. Knowing no one was looking, he sometimes danced. But if even a deer or a rabbit stared at him, Nick stopped dancing. "I don't dance alone," Nick announced to the deer or to the rabbit. Dancing alone made him feel foolish. Not dancing made him feel dead. He had nothing to do. He did it sitting under an oak tree, staring into space. The oak leaves rustling in the wind sounded to Nick like a dance band. The dance band in the trees played the songs that Nick and Nell used to dance to. Nick sang along. An image of Nell, more graceful than ever, appeared to Nick in the woods. They danced, first in the woods, then in a ballroom, then on an ocean liner. Nick crooned the songs that he and his image of Nell danced to. The songs echoed through the woods. Not that Nick heard a word. He didn't know he was singing or dancing. He didn't know he was in the clearing in the woods. He only knew that he was holding Nell, the Nell of his dreams, in his arms, the Nell who had turned her back on Enrique Vega's facile footwork, the Nell who scorned the shallow gaming room glitter of Mac Black, the Nell who chose Nick above all. One day, just as he and Nell had gone into their twirl, Nick's daydream was interrupted. It took a moment or two before Nick realized what was going on. Someone was dancing. This wasn't a dream. Really dancing in the woods, dancing right in front of Nick. It took a while for him to wake out of his daydream and be aware of what exactly he was looking at. He was looking at a small red fox. The fox was dancing to Nick's songs. He was not that good. He was a fox. Not a trained dancer, but no doubt about it, he was doing what could only be described as a foxtrot. Nick suddenly clapped his hands at the fox in 4/4 time. The fox perked in air, then followed the beat, uncertainly at first, but with increasing confidence. For the remainder of the day, Nick rehearsed the fox. "That was pretty good," Nick said. "Now try this." The fox followed Nick with a natural animal grace, of course. But what was more interesting to Nick was his flair, wit, and gusto. The moon rose. Rabbits came to watch. Deer, geese, and chipmunk too. Birds who should have been asleep chirped from their nests. Squirrels, too nervous to sit still, chattered in counterpoint as they ran back and forth overhead. Nick and the fox danced the night away. The moon was their spotlight. "My God, we're an act!" Nick cried. Now, every morning, Nick rose early and ran to the woods to rehearse the fox. He taught him everything he had taught Nell, the waltz, the tango, and best of all, the foxtrot. Within a month, with lessons from dawn to dusk, the fox became more expert at the foxtrot than even Nell. So that's what Nick called him, Foxtrot. They were friends. One day, Nick said to him, "I don't intend to exploit you. We won't turn your genius into a freak show. You and I will not be an animal act. We will be an act of joy." Foxtrot didn't care one way or another. He would do whatever Nick asked. Nick found himself in the most trusting relationship he'd ever had. Nick was happy. Well, when you're happy, you let your guard down. You're not prepared for the unexpected. Imagine Nick's surprise one morning when he took his usual walk to the woods, carrying his regular thermos of coffee for himself and a ham and cheese on a seeded roll for Foxtrot, when he saw a big giant chain link fence circling the entire length and breadth of the woods. "No trespassing. On this site will be built a new gaming casino owned and operated by Mac Black. Violators will be prosecuted." And in the distance, from deep within the woods, Nick heard the thunderous growl of bulldozers. Frantically, Nick ran around the fence, calling Foxtrot's name. Where was Foxtrot? Nick tried to scale the fence. Security guards dragged him off. He tried to dig under the fence. He was arrested and thrown in jail. When he got out of jail, the woods were gone. Mac Black's new casino was in his place. Nell and Enrique Vega were the star attractions. Nick broke into the opening night performance, running on stage and screaming out, "What have you done with my fox?" He was arrested and thrown in jail. Nell bailed him out. "Forget about the fox," she said. "He probably got everything he could out of you and went out on his own, just like me. If you ever get a better offer, you'd leave somebody flat too." "Not if it hurts their feelings, I wouldn't," replied Nick. "You haven't learned a thing," said Nell, and handed him $50 to get out of town. Nick went back to the city. He used Nell's $50 to buy food and a bedroll and found living quarters with the homeless in a tunnel by the railroad tracks. On pleasant days, he'd camp out under a tree in the park. It reminded him of the old days in the woods with Foxtrot. At night in the tunnel, he'd watch the trains go by. Could Foxtrot be on one of them? Perhaps rescued from the bulldozers by some kindly, rich family who took him in as one of their own and lavished on him love and attention. On special occasions, Foxtrot might have favored them with a dance. Nick's reverie was interrupted by a shout. "Look what I caught for my dinner!" There in the tunnel stood a grinning, unshaven brute holding aloft a sickly, exhausted, malnourished fox. "Foxtrot!" Nick cried, his heart pounding with terror and joy. The feeble, fear-stricken fox, not far from death's door, weakly wagged the tail he was being swung by. Nick bellowed, "That's my fox!" He leaped up and grabbed for Foxtrot, but was sent sprawling with a brutal shove to the chest. "Catch your own fox, buddy!" An unbelievably vicious fight ensued. Won by Nick only because he was fighting for the life of a beloved friend. And he was helped considerably by Foxtrot, who bit his captor on the hand, leg, ear, and butt. The victorious Nick looked in worse shape than Foxtrot. The two friends went to live under a bridge that spanned the river, and it was here that Nick nursed Foxtrot back to health. But who was to nurse Nick? Everything hurt. He wheezed, he coughed, he limped. His right leg refused to go in the same direction as his left leg. "You have to dance for the two of us now," said Nick. And Foxtrot did. His audience was the dregs of society, coming from far and wide, from tunnels, underpasses, under bridges, abandoned buildings, shacks, back alleys, doorways, lean-tos, holes in the ground. And every performance they tossed what they had in after every performance they tossed what they had in their pockets. Nickels, dimes, quarters, a few dollars bills fell into a hat at Foxtrot's feet. As Foxtrot performed, cars and trucks sped by on the bridge, making a rhythmic rackety-rack that sounded to Nick like steel drums. It gave him an inspiration, a new dance, drawing on the metallic beat of the bridge to celebrate the grit and endurance of lasting friendship. By the end of the first week of rehearsal, Nick knew what he would call his dance: bridge work. You never can tell when it will happen, but sometimes the show just comes together beautifully. Word got out. Well-connected people, people in the know, people in the business began dropping in on rehearsal. Foxtrot's opening made the best bets section of New York Magazine. On opening night, the stretch limos started arriving early. The uptown, downtown, pop, dance, arts, and hip-hop crowd poured onto the narrow strip of land under the bridge. They came with heavy security to protect them from the homeless, who looked down from scaffolding hanging from girders. The band, made up entirely of the homeless or almost homeless, started the overture. The bridge clattered in harmony. The audience, uncomfortable no matter where they stood, leaned forward in anticipation. A downbeat. And Foxtrot took the stage. And seconds later, he took everyone's heart. Bridge work was a triumph. Choreographed with flash and finesse, danced with rowdy elegance, it enlivened the spirit and enriched the soul. Screams of adulation greeted the finale. Applause and foot-stomping so thunderous it shook the moorings of the bridge. Nick was euphoric. Then he spotted Nell in the crowd. But she was not with Enrique Vega. He wondered if this was a new dance partner. She introduced him to her companion, Mac Black, who said, "Congratulations, your show is brilliant, thrilling, a crowning entertaining experience, a great work of art. I think I know how to fix it. We'll talk." Mac Black and Nell, surrounded by security, zoomed off in their stretch limo. Nick's euphoria was ended. The next night, Mac Black came back without Nell. "The Fox is a genius, and you're brilliant within your limitations. But I gotta be honest with you, the show is slow. The Fox needs a girl in the act." Nick went berserk. He had to be restrained from beating Mac Black with his cane. "We'll talk," said Mac Black, driving off in his stretch limo. The next night, Nell came by without Mac Black. "I have dumped Enrique Vega," she said. "I must dance with the Fox." The next night, Mac Black came back without Nell. "Are you being fair to the Fox? Under your management, he plays bridges and tunnels. Under my management, he and Nell become the star attraction of every casino in America, TV, movies, the halftime act at Super Bowl." Nick went berserk. Mac Black's security flattened him. "We'll talk," said Mac Black, driving off in his stretch limo. The next night, Nell came by without Mac Black. "The Fox has one chance for the big time, and you're in his way," she said. "You're a twisted, sick man, outside and inside. Can't you ever think of anyone but yourself?" The next night, Mac Black came back with a surgeon. The surgeon said, "I can operate on your leg so that you can stop being a twisted, sick man outside and inside. And you can dance again. My fee is you give Mac Black the Fox." "We'll talk," said Mac Black, driving off with the surgeon in a stretch limo. The next night, Nell was back without Mac Black. "My new solo act opens tomorrow night at Mac Black's new casino. Bring the Fox." What was Nick to do? The next night, he and Foxtrot sat at ringside seats, the guests of Mac Black. Nell's solo performance was glorious, far better than anything she did with Nick. Nick stole anxious looks at Foxtrot during the act. He seemed enchanted. After she took her bows, Nell gave a curtain speech. "Thank you so much for your kindness, but there is another great dancer in the room tonight. And perhaps with your encouragement, we can persuade him to come up here on stage and do a number with me. A spotlight fell on Foxtrot. The audience roared its approval. Foxtrot shook his head a modest no. The applause went on. He looked to Nick for guidance. Nick knew he had no right to hold Foxtrot back. He barely managed the nod that sent Foxtrot skipping onto the stage. Nell cued the band, a foxtrot. The two dancers carefully circled one another with getting acquainted steps. Then they went into their embrace. They looked like they had been doing together a lifetime. The audience stopped applauding. They practically stopped breathing. No one had ever seen anything like it. They danced for an hour. Nick knew what he had to do. It took another hour after the dance for the applause to die down. In the calm that followed, Nick said to Foxtrot, I am going away tonight to the hospital to have my legs operated on so that I can dance again. It may take a long time for me to get better, a very long time. I'm asking Nell and Mac Black to look after you. Nick walked out into the night. Foxtrot was sad to see Nick go, but was glad to be dancing with Nell. So he was sad and he was glad. At the hospital, the surgeon was alerted, his expert team waiting for Nick's arrival, but Nick didn't show up, nor did he go back to the bridge or the tunnel or anywhere else where anyone knew him. He dropped out of sight, almost as if he had to, so that Nell and Foxtrot could properly launch their new act. Opening tonight at Mac Black's Club Vegas, Nell and Foxtrot. They were a stupendous success. Foxtrot brought out the gentler side of Nell. She became caring, even thoughtful, not on a regular basis, but often enough to be noticed and commented on. Mac Black made millions off them, but he didn't exploit them. He didn't have to. He already made millions off everything else. He got them a dance spot on the Academy Awards ceremony in Hollywood, watched by viewers in every part of the world. They were to dance one of the nominated songs, a foxtrot, at the Rainbow Ballroom in Kyoto, Japan. Nick turned on the floor waxer to watch the TV monitors overhead. The club was closed for the night. Nick was the only one there, doing his job, in which he took great pride. Gliding his waxer across the ballroom floor made him feel almost as if he was in the business again. He watched Foxtrot and Nell with fascination. He began to move to their rhythm until he was dancing on his ruined legs. It didn't seem to matter. He danced beautifully. He didn't notice that Foxtrot and Nell's number had ended. He didn't notice that the music had stopped and the TV monitors had gone black. He didn't even notice that he was happy. Nick danced alone. Thank you. Now, I wonder how that was going to sound on radio with no pictures. Not as good as I'm thinking. If any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them with my own form of an answer. Would anybody like to ask anything, say anything, make a statement, make a closing? And this is an educated crowd. All right.
Back here.
Back where? Back where?
Back here, back here.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there you are.
Hi, Jules. I was wondering, in terms of putting pictures with words, do you think there's a counterpart in pure fiction? Do you know what I mean?
I think there's certainly a counterpart in theater and film, and I think there's very much a counterpart in fiction, which, I mean, that's it seemed to me, maybe I noticed it only that late, but it seemed to me that beginning with J.D. Salinger's stories in the New Yorker, it seemed to be like movies on paper. I mean, then one saw images there, and subsequent to that, I think movies have influenced a lot of fiction, a lot of writing, and I mean, what they put in, what they choose to dramatize, and for me, in terms of my work, it's been mostly in terms of what I do for the theater, and on occasion for film, but mostly for the theater. Yes, sir.
When you were in the Army, you were...
You told me we got drafted on the same day. In the Signal Corps Photo Center.
We were basic training together.
Yep.
You had the spirit of St. Louis in those days. What happened to that?
I had experienced what?
Spirit of St. Louis. You were writing that.
Oh, no, I was writing not the Spirit of St. Louis, which was the creation of a man named Lindbergh, but certainly you've heard of him. How'd they forget so soon? But no, there was a comic strip, actually a comic book supplement to newspapers, an 8-page feature back in the 1940s into the 50s by a man named Will Eisner, who was an extraordinary influence on other cartoonists. And for that matter, on filmmakers, because, I mean, one of the stories is that Orson Welles studied the Spirit's layouts to help design Citizen Kane. It's, whether true or not, it could be true because the Will Eisner's work was so extraordinarily graphic and dramatic in telling a story, and the pictures were not just, as they so often are in comics today, there to exercise graphic brilliance. They were there as an aid to tell us storytelling. They conjured up the whole atmosphere. Eisner himself was influenced by German filmmakers like Fritz Lang and some others. You know, that all this stuff goes back and forth between the cartoonists and the filmmakers very much more than any other form. And I forget the question. I'm just rambling on. I don't know where I'm going. But you said before you were at the Signal Corps Photo Center.
We were stationed together, and we had bunks right next to each other and went to
Now,
basic training.
At the Signal Corps Photo Center in Long Island City on Steinway Street.
You were painting helmets with names on them?
That's right. It's now the Astoria Film Studios. But when I got stationed there, I was about to say sentenced there. This is my view of the. When I got stationed there, I mean, I was drafted on January 19th, the same day as my brother-in-law Harold over there, and a week later I was in Long Island City fighting the war. You know, and what was amazing about being in the Signal Corps Photo Center is it was one of those, there were few in the Army, here and there and other places. It was one of the country clubs. There was somehow, anybody with influence managed to get himself stationed at one of these soft berths, one of these soft jobs. And how I got there, I don't know, because I was in the Bronx. I didn't know anybody, had no connections. But I was virtually the only one there who wasn't a junior. There was Samuel Goldwyn Jr. there, and Eric von Straholm Jr., and I mean, everybody was a junior. And then when a manpower commission came through from Washington and discovered that there were 80 or 90 more people on this base than there was supposed to be, they suddenly got everybody transferred, and all the juniors went into a panic, and you couldn't get a phone line out from 10 blocks around because all long-distance lines were jammed to Hollywood. And within 2 days, every name was taken off that first list, and then there was a second list, and more phone calls to Hollywood, to daddy, to uncle, to cousin. And those names were taken off, and finally they got me and sent me down to Georgia. Yes?
Did the questioners wait for the microphone, please? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I was so glad you mentioned Eisner and the Spirit, such a wonderful strip. But what I really wanted to ask you was, has it ever occurred, well, it must have occurred to you, how prophetic Little Murders has turned out to be? I'm always struck when I see what's going on in the art world today, and I think back 30 years to 30 plus years to Little Murders, about the artist who sculpted in shit.
No, he was a photographer, and he took pictures of shit.
It's a picture of shit, right? Yeah,
And when it was when the play opened originally on Broadway in 1967, April of 1967. It was the first time the word shit had ever been used on the Broadway stage. And in fact, at the end of the evening, Leonard Lyons, who some of you may remember was a famous Broadway columnist, came over to me and he grabbed me by the lapels and he said, "How dare you use language like this on a second night of Passover?" But, you know, it's Little Murders was never meant to be prophetic. I mean, when I was writing, I was writing out of a situation that I thought was transparently obvious out there in society, which was a breakdown of all forms of established authority after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I thought it was fascinating that on every level, everything seemed to be in this intense Cold War climate in America, dissolving in terms of respect for different forms of authority. And that's what having failed to see that commented on by anyone, I decided I had to write about it. I tried doing about it in cartoons. It didn't work. I worked on it for 2 years as a novel. That didn't get anywhere because I got hung up in descriptions. I spent pages trying to describe snow, and I knew this was not the right job for me. So I began to dramatize it, and as soon as, and it was one of those wonderful transcendent moments in my life. That the first day's work on it as a play, and prior to that I swore I would never try to write for the theater. First of all, I didn't know I had the talent, but secondly, since I loved theater and went to the theater all the time and discovered over and over again that the plays I went to in preview and thought were wonderful closed after 2 nights, and the plays that won everything were plays I generally walked out on after the first act. So I thought, if I ever write a play I'm proud of, it'll close after after the first night. And in fact, it closed in a week, the first production of Little Murders. But I was out to say something that I didn't think was being said to an audience that I thought was ready for it, and the audience was, the critics weren't. And 2 years later, when the play came back, and what I had to say was better understood because more dissolution in terms of established authority had taken place, the play was a success. It was also helped by an extraordinary production by Alan Arkin, who directed it, and a great cast of actors. But I never thought of it as prescient or prophetic or any of those things. I thought of it as a documentary, a kind of the world I lived in. Yes, ma'am.
Beautiful new work, Jules. I'm still
Thank you, Mary.
amazed. As a fellow artist and would-be writer, as you've seen some of my work, it's
I have indeed.
a little bit more detailed and frustratingly so. Do you feel that there's a parallel with writing, and I've had your humor and truth class, and your simplistic lines that just frustrate me so when they're so beautiful, the kind of core to writing that has to get so simplistic as your lines do and as you tried to teach us?
I think we don't want to use the word simplistic.
Well, simplistic in there, there's the truth. There, one simple line.
Yeah. Simple, yes.
Thank
Simplistic, no.
Okay.
Simple-minded, perhaps, but that's another point.
Is there a parallel with writing?
Was of course Hemingway, who made famous the line, whether he created it or not, I don't, less is more. You take a look at a caricaturist like Al Hirschfeld, always brilliant, always extraordinary. As he got into his 90s, he actually got better. That it's this odd thing about living and doing something and loving what you're doing and doing it for a very long time and doing it, that by the time you reach your 70s or so, you begin to figure out how to do it. And it's by leaving things out. And but it's not a kind of deliberate leaving things out. There's no technique to it. It's not even a stylistic choice. It's that this is the way you see things, that the way your vision has become altered in a way so that all of the fancy footwork you might have done at one time when you were younger as a form of expressing yourself, but certainly as a form of showing off, stops being necessary, and it gets, you may have lost your fastball, but the junk you throw is quite wonderful. And so I think the simplicity that you meant to speak of speaks to that. As Roger mentioned in my adoration of Fred Astaire, I always looked on Astaire, as so many people have, as somebody who did the hardest job in the world and made it look as if he wasn't doing anything, just walking on air. And although you knew at the same, he'd sent 2 messages. One was, of course you knew you couldn't do this. But he created the illusion that you could, which was the great illusion those movies in those years of the 30s and 40s, those Depression films created, that all of us in that time, or most of us living in that time, who led lives that were quite perilous economically would go to a movie and see what we insisted was our future, which is that we wore top hats and tails, and we didn't have fights with our wives. We had spats, and we went to our clubs and slept in our club that night. I mean, how many times I dreamed of sleeping in my club after a spat with my wife? It was, and it didn't seem. And they talk about these things as escape. No, I mean the escape was the Bronx. This was my real life, and I just had to live long enough so I could actually occupy it. And it was that fantasy, the austere fantasy, in a sense, that I saw, and I think millions of others saw, not so much as a fantasy, but as a documentary about the future you. and that's all it was. Yes.
Why a fox and not an accommodating female dancer?
Why a fox, not a comment? Sexism. There is no way of explaining that other than to say in writing anything and drawing anything, you do what seems to you to work, and if there's a reason behind it, and if there's a sense of intellectual inquiry behind it, you're better off not knowing what it is until you've long finished what it is you've done. Once you start thinking, why have I done this, and what have I done about this, and why am I doing this, and why this particular thing, you become an editor and not a writer, and you become a plotter and not an artist. It's unless of course you're Henry James, but that's another story. It's better not to worry about those things. It may be appropriate if you choose to worry about these things once you've finished and got it locked in, but not at the moment. You just have to follow. It's like a private detective following a trail. You just follow the trail, or a fox following a trail. Why? It's a foxtrot. Anyhow, you as foxes are getting close to my trail, so I'm going to say good night. Thank you very, very much.
Jules Feiffer, the first speaker of our evening lecture series from the 2002 Writers' Conference at Southampton College.